The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Silver City as Jake Miller led his latest acquisition, a magnificent black stallion, through the quiet alleyways behind the general store. At 32, Jake had earned a reputation as the finest horse thief in the New Mexico territory, though he preferred to think of himself as a redistributor of misappropriated equines. He'd developed a peculiar code over the years. He only stole from cruel owners who mistreated their animals, and he made sure each horse found its way to someone who would treat it properly. The stallion's previous owner, William Thompson, had been notorious for working his horses to death in his silver mining operation. Jake had watched for weeks as Thompson's men whipped and abused the magnificent creature. Now, the horse would find a new home with old Samuel Davis, a kind-hearted rancher who had lost his best stud to mountain lions last month. Jake knew it wasn't strictly legal, but he'd long ago stopped measuring right and wrong by the letter of the law. As Jake rounded the corner near the livery stable, he caught sight of Sheriff James Wilson's new deputies clustered around the water trough. Something about their presence made his skin crawl. In the 3 months since Wilson had taken office, he'd brought in a dozen new men, all strangers to Silver City. They carried themselves like predators, not peacekeepers, and Jake had noticed how the townspeople had started hurrying indoors whenever the deputies passed by. Sarah Johnson, who ran the boarding house on Main Street, had confided in Jake just yesterday about missing jewelry and money after Deputy Thomas Miller had conducted an impromptu inspection of her establishment. Similar stories had been circulating through town: merchandise disappearing from the general store, cattle vanishing from outlying ranches, mining equipment gone missing. The sheriff's office dismissed every complaint, but Jake had begun to notice a pattern. The sound of breaking glass and a woman's scream shattered the evening quiet. Jake quickly secured the stallion and crept toward the commotion. Outside the Silver City Bank, he watched as 2 of Wilson's deputies roughly handled Catherine Davis, Samuel's daughter. They were accusing her of suspicious behavior as they rifled through her handbag, though Jake knew she worked as the bank's bookkeeper and had every right to be there after hours. What happened next would change everything. As Jake observed from the shadows, he saw Deputy Miller slip something from his own pocket into Catherine's bag before triumphantly pulling it back out, a folded document that Jake couldn't quite make out. The deputies made a show of discovering this evidence, using it as justification to arrest her. Jake realized he was witnessing a carefully orchestrated performance, one that had likely been repeated throughout town. The pieces suddenly fell into place. The new sheriff and his men weren't law enforcement at all, but an organized gang using their badges as cover for a systematic takeover of Silver City. Jake had seen similar schemes in other towns, though never executed with such precision. They were slowly gaining control of key businesses and properties through a combination of intimidation, theft, and fraudulent arrests. That night, as Jake lay sleepless in his small cabin on the outskirts of town, he wrestled with an unfamiliar feeling of responsibility. He'd spent years operating in the shadows, breaking the law while following his own moral compass. But now, he found himself in the unique position of being the only person who could see the full scope of Wilson's operation. His years of watching, waiting, and moving unseen had given him skills that might just save the town. Elizabeth Miller, the young widow who taught at the schoolhouse, had been compiling a secret record of the deputies' activities. Jake had noticed her watching from her classroom window, making careful notes. Tomorrow, he would find a way to speak with her, to combine what they knew. It was time to build a case against the corrupt sheriff and his men, assuming he could do it without revealing his own illegal activities in the process. The irony wasn't lost on Jake that he, a known horse thief, might be Silver City's best hope for justice, but he had something the other townspeople lacked. He understood how criminals thought, how they moved, and most importantly, how they could be caught. As he finally drifted off to sleep, Jake began forming a plan that would require all his skills of stealth and misdirection. Only this time, he would be stealing something far more valuable than horses. He would be stealing back his town's freedom. The desert dawn crept over Silver City like a cat stretching in the sun, casting long shadows between the weathered buildings. Jake made his way toward the schoolhouse well before the morning bell, his boots leaving shallow impressions in the dusty street. He'd chosen this early hour carefully. Fewer eyes to watch him approach Elizabeth Miller's domain, and the deputies would still be sleeping off their nightly patrols that consisted more of gambling than law enforcement. The schoolhouse stood apart from the other buildings, its white-painted boards maintaining a dignity despite the harsh desert elements that had stripped away much of its original luster. Jake noticed fresh horse tracks leading to the back of the building, unusual for this time of day. His years of tracking stolen horses had taught him to read such signs like others read books, and these tracks told him someone else had been here recently. Moving cautiously around the building's perimeter, Jake caught the sound of hushed voices through an open window. He recognized Elizabeth's refined tones, but the other voice, male and gravelly, sent him pressing against the weathered walls. It was Deputy William, the sheriff's most brutal enforcer. Jake's hand instinctively moved to his hip, where he'd hidden a small derringer. Not his preferred weapon, but one that wouldn't draw attention like a gun belt would. "I'm telling you one last time, Mrs. Miller," William's voice carried through the window, thick with threat. "Those records you're keeping. Hand them over now, or there might be an unfortunate accident during tomorrow's school day." The deputy's words were followed by the sound of books being roughly swept from a desk, falling with hollow thuds against the wooden floor. Jake's mind raced through options. He couldn't burst in. That would only confirm the deputy's suspicions about Elizabeth's documentation and probably get them both killed. Instead, he moved silently to the front of the building, picked up a loose stone, and hurled it through the window of the empty shop across the street. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the quiet morning. Deputy Williams' boots could be heard stomping toward the schoolhouse door. "Don't think this conversation is over," he snarled at Elizabeth. Jake pressed himself against the wall as William emerged, hand on his gun, and strode toward the broken window. The moment the deputy passed, Jake slipped through the schoolhouse door. Elizabeth stood amid scattered papers and overturned books, her face pale but determined. Her eyes widened at Jake's appearance, but she didn't cry out. Instead, she quickly gathered several papers from a hidden compartment beneath a floorboard that William had missed. "I wondered when you'd come," she whispered, her voice steady despite the morning's violence. "I've seen you watching them too." Jake helped her retrieve the fallen books, speaking in low tones. "Those records, they're not safe here anymore. William will be back with reinforcements." He paused, considering their limited options. "There's a cave system in the Red Rocks north of town. Used to hide stolen horses there before I—" He left the sentence unfinished, but Elizabeth nodded in understanding. "I've documented everything," she said, producing a leather-bound journal from beneath her desk. "Tax money disappearing, false arrests, protection payments from the merchants. But there's something bigger happening. The sheriff's been meeting with strangers from Tombstone late at night. They're planning something that has the deputies nervous." Jake took the journal, his weathered hands handling it like it was made of gold. "Tonight," he said, "meet me at sunset behind the old Miller barn. Bring only what you can carry on horseback." He saw the question in her eyes and added, "We're not running away. But we need to move these records somewhere safe while we figure out how to use them." As Jake slipped out of the schoolhouse, he noticed fresh tracks overlaying Williams. More deputies had arrived while he was inside. They were watching the building from the shadows of the general store. His years of evading posses came in handy as he casually walked away, taking a circuitous route that wouldn't draw attention to Elizabeth's school. The sun climbed higher over Silver City, and Jake could feel the noose tightening. Whatever the sheriff was planning with those men from Tombstone, it was big enough to kill for. And now he and Elizabeth were the only ones who might be able to stop it, assuming they could survive long enough to expose the truth. Jake touched the derringer at his hip and headed toward the livery stable. He'd need more than just a small gun before this was over. Jake Miller wiped the sweat from his brow as he crouched behind a weathered boulder, watching Sheriff William Thompson and his deputies loading crates into a wagon under cover of darkness. 3 months of careful observation had confirmed his suspicions. The lawmen of Silver City were using their badges to run a sophisticated horse theft operation, stealing prime stock from honest ranchers and selling them across the territory with forged papers. The irony wasn't lost on Jake. He'd spent years building a reputation as an honest horse trader after leaving his own checkered past behind, only to discover the real criminals wore tin stars. The desert wind whispered through the scraggly brush as he counted 8 horses being loaded, recognizing the brands of the Davis and Wilson ranches. His conscience wouldn't let him stay silent any longer. Back in town, Sarah Johnson swept the boardwalk in front of her father's general store, pausing to watch Thomas Davis storm into the sheriff's office yet again. The rancher had lost 12 horses in the past month alone, But Thompson's investigations mysteriously went nowhere. Sarah had noticed Jake Miller watching the sheriff's men lately, and something in his eyes told her he knew more than he was letting on. The noon sun beat down mercilessly as Jake made his way to Samuel Wilson's spread outside town. The old rancher was known for his shrewd mind and influence with the other landowners. Jake found him repairing fence posts, his weathered face creased with worry. "Mr. Wilson, I need your help," Jake began carefully. "I know who's been stealing the horses, but you're not going to like it." The explanation that followed left Samuel gripping his fence post until his knuckles went white. By sunset, a small group had gathered in the back room of Johnson's store. Jake, Samuel Wilson, Thomas Davis, and James Miller, no relation to Jake. Sarah served coffee while they discussed the evidence Jake had gathered. "Thompson's got most folks fooled," Jake explained. "But I've tracked his deputies moving stolen horses through Dead Man's Pass every third Thursday. They're using old mining caves to hide them until buyers arrive." Catherine Thompson, the sheriff's wife, had her own suspicions about her husband's sudden wealth. The new house, fine clothes, and frequent trips to Tombstone seemed excessive on a lawman's salary. When she discovered letters detailing horse sales in her husband's desk, she knew she had to act. Under pretense of visiting her sister in Abilene, she arranged to meet Jake Miller at the abandoned Miller homestead. The meeting with Catherine confirmed Jake's worst fears. Thompson wasn't just stealing horses. He was using his position to intimidate witnesses and eliminate competition. 3 honest horse traders had already been run out of town on trumped-up charges. Jake knew he'd be next if Thompson discovered his investigation. But the sheriff's wife had brought something valuable: a ledger showing payments from buyers in Fort Worth. Sarah watched with growing concern as more of Thompson's deputies began lingering near her father's store. Their casual questions about Jake Miller's comings and goings carried veiled threats. When she spotted Deputy James Davis following Jake one evening, she created a distraction that allowed him to slip away through the alley. Their eyes met briefly in silent understanding. They were all in danger now. Samuel Wilson called in favors from ranchers across 3 counties, building a network of allies willing to stand against Thompson's corruption. Jake's knowledge of the territory proved invaluable as they mapped out the sheriff's operation. But their planning session at the Wilson Ranch was interrupted by urgent news. Thompson had arrested Thomas Davis on charges of horse theft, turning the accusations back on one of his victims. The desert itself seemed to hold its breath as Jake led a midnight rescue party to free Davis from the jail. Sarah provided the distraction, staging a small fire near the livery stable that drew most of Thompson's men away. Catherine's inside knowledge of her husband's habits told them when he would be absent. But as Jake worked the cell lock, bootsteps on the boardwalk announced that their timing had failed. Elizabeth Davis, Thomas's wife, rode through the night to deliver warning to the outlying ranches. Thompson was gathering hired guns from Tombstone. The sheriff meant to eliminate all opposition in one brutal sweep. Jake knew they had to move faster than planned. With Samuel Wilson's help, he began evacuating families to safe locations while organizing the townspeople who were willing to fight. Mary Wilson, Samuel's daughter, proved an unexpected ally. Her job at the telegraph office allowed her to intercept Thompson's messages to his buyers and hired guns. She also managed to get warnings to neighboring towns about the corruption in Silver City. But when Thompson's men caught her sending unauthorized wires, she barely escaped with the evidence they needed. The pieces were falling into place, but Jake felt the noose tightening. Thompson's men had nearly caught him twice, and he knew his time was running out. The stolen horses hidden in the mining caves would provide proof of the sheriff's crimes, but reaching them meant crossing open desert under the watchful eyes of corrupt deputies. He needed a plan that even a desperate lawman wouldn't expect. Jake studied the rough map Mary had drawn of the deputies' patrol routes, noting how they'd established a near-perfect net around Silver City. But their very thoroughness had created a pattern, one he could exploit. The corrupt lawmen were so focused on the main trails and watering holes that they'd neglected the treacherous box canyons to the north, deemed too dangerous for horse travel by most riders. But Jake hadn't earned his reputation by following conventional wisdom. Under the cover of a moonless night, Jake led a small group including Samuel Wilson and 3 trusted ranchers through the narrow canyon passages. Their horses' hooves were wrapped in burlap to muffle the sound against stone, while the high walls kept their movements hidden from any watching eyes. The desert wind howled through the rocky corridors, masking what little noise they couldn't avoid making. They emerged near the abandoned mining complex where Thompson's operation stored its stolen horses before moving them to buyers in Tombstone. Jake had discovered the location weeks ago but hadn't dared approach until now. The sight that greeted them confirmed his worst fears. Dozens of branded horses from local ranches were penned in the old ore yard, including prized stock he recognized from farms whose owners had mysteriously lost their land to Thompson's foreclosures. Samuel Wilson's face hardened as he spotted his own missing stallion among the stolen horses. "This is all the proof we need," he whispered. "But getting it to the territorial marshal in Fort Worth won't be easy." Jake nodded grimly. They'd need more than just witness accounts. They needed documentation linking Thompson to the operation, and that meant getting into the sheriff's office itself. Mary's latest intelligence suggested Thompson was planning something big. A major shipment of stolen horses to buyers from Abilene, along with a coordinated effort to drive the remaining honest ranchers from their land. The timing was critical. If they could catch Thompson in the act and get proof to the authorities, they might save Silver City. If they failed, the town would fall completely under his control. Jake devised a plan that relied on misdirection and timing. While he and a small group created a distraction by releasing some of the stolen horses near town, Mary would use her position at the telegraph office to send a false message about territorial marshals arriving from Fort Worth. The resulting chaos would give Samuel Wilson and others the chance to search Thompson's office for incriminating documents. The risk was enormous. If Thompson saw through their ruse, they'd lose their last chance to expose him. Worse, he'd have the excuse he needed to move against them openly. Jake knew some of the townspeople would die if it came to open fighting. Good people who'd trusted him to find a better way. The weight of their faith pressed down on him heavier than the desert heat. Elizabeth, the widow who ran the general store, had been secretly stockpiling ammunition and supplies for weeks, hiding them among her regular inventory. She'd lost her husband to Thompson's schemes and had thrown her lot in with Jake's resistance without hesitation. Now she provided crucial information about which deputies could be trusted and which were firmly in Thompson's pocket. As they made their way back through the canyon maze, Jake's mind raced through the possibilities. They had to time everything perfectly: the horse release, the false telegraph, the office search, all while keeping Thompson's attention divided. One mistake would doom not just their plan, but the entire town. The desert dawn was approaching, painting the canyon walls in shades of blood and gold, and with it would come their moment of truth. Jake remembered the day he'd first arrived in Silver City, a horse thief looking for easy pickings. He'd never meant to become the town's last hope for justice, but watching honest people suffer under Thompson's cruel regime had awakened something in him he'd thought long dead. Now, as he led his small band of rebels back toward town, he realized that redemption sometimes came in unexpected forms. The scorching afternoon sun cast long shadows across Silver City's dusty main street as Jake Miller crouched behind an overturned wagon, his heart pounding. He'd spent months building trust with the townspeople after his past as a horse thief, and now everything hinged on the next few moments. Sheriff William Thompson and his corrupt deputies had cornered the resistance fighters in the livery stable, but Jake knew they hadn't counted on his intimate knowledge of every horse in town. Through the stable's back window, Jake could see Sarah Davis trying to calm the nervous horses while Thomas Wilson and James Johnson readied their weapons. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same skills that once made him an outlaw were now crucial to saving these people who'd given him a second chance. The corrupt lawmen had finally shown their true colors, demanding protection money and seizing property under false pretenses. A bullet splintered the wooden beam near Jake's head as Deputy Samuel Miller, no relation thankfully, tried to flush him out. The deputy's shot spooked the horses inside, creating the exact diversion Jake had been waiting for. He whistled a specific pattern, one he'd used countless times to orchestrate horse thefts, and the animals responded instantly. The stable doors burst open as a dozen panicked horses charged out, scattering Thompson's men. Elizabeth Wilson, the schoolteacher who'd first believed in Jake's redemption, had positioned townspeople on the rooftops with buckets of water. As the horses created chaos below, they doused the street, turning the hard-packed dirt into slick mud. The deputies, unused to such unconventional tactics, struggled to keep their footing while trying to maintain their positions. "Now!" Jake's voice carried over the commotion as Thomas and James emerged from their hiding spots, using the confusion to outflank the corrupt lawmen. The townspeople had spent weeks secretly preparing for this moment, converting their shops and homes into defensive positions under Jake's guidance. He'd learned from years of studying town layouts for his thefts, knowing exactly how to turn urban terrain to their advantage. Sheriff Thompson's face contorted with rage as he realized his carefully constructed facade of authority was crumbling. He'd underestimated these simple townspeople, and more importantly, he'd underestimated Jake. The former horse thief had spent months gathering evidence of Thompson's crimes, building a network of witnesses and documenting every illegal seizure and extorted payment. Mary Johnson, the telegraph operator, had been instrumental in secretly contacting the territorial marshal, timing their resistance to coincide with his arrival. As Thompson's men regrouped for another assault, the distant sound of approaching horsemen caught everyone's attention. The sheriff's expression shifted from anger to fear as he recognized the distinctive rhythm of a marshal's posse. But Thompson wasn't finished yet. He signaled to his most loyal deputies, and they began setting fires to the buildings along Main Street. Jake had anticipated this too. Catherine Miller, the owner of the general store, had organized bucket brigades and positioned water barrels throughout town. The community's preparation proved its worth as townspeople emerged from their positions to fight the flames while maintaining their defense. Jake spotted his chance when Thompson became separated from his men. Years of reading horse behavior had taught him to recognize when someone was about to make a desperate move. The sheriff was edging toward the bank, where Jake knew Emma Thompson, the sheriff's own wife, had hidden evidence of his corruption. She'd been secretly working with Jake for months, unable to stomach her husband's descent into tyranny. In a move that surprised even himself, Jake didn't take the direct approach. Instead, he circled around through the alleyways he'd once used to escape posses, emerging behind the bank just as Thompson slipped inside. The sheriff found himself caught between Jake at the back door and Emma at the front, holding the ledgers that proved every illegal transaction. The territorial marshal arrived to find the town's citizens had already subdued most of the corrupt deputies. Thompson's attempt to destroy the evidence had failed, and his own wife's testimony would prove devastating. Jake watched from the sidelines as the marshal took control, feeling a strange sense of completion. He'd spent years learning how to take from towns like Silver City, but those same skills had finally allowed him to give something back. The aftermath brought changes no one had expected. The townspeople, led by Elizabeth Wilson's impassioned advocacy, petitioned for Jake to be appointed as their new sheriff. His intimate knowledge of criminal methods, they argued, made him uniquely qualified to protect the town. The marshal, impressed by the organized resistance Jake had coordinated, supported the recommendation. As the sun set on Silver City that evening, Jake stood on the boardwalk outside the newly vacated sheriff's office, running his fingers over the badge that now rested on his chest. Sarah Davis approached, leading his favorite horse, one he'd once tried to steal but had ended up legitimately buying with money earned from honest work. "Never thought I'd see the day," she said with a smile, when Silver City's most notorious horse thief would become its most trusted lawman. The town gathered that night in the newly repaired Saloon, not just to celebrate their victory, but to recognize how their community had transformed. Jake looked around at the faces that had become family. Thomas and James discussing plans for expanding the livery stable, Elizabeth and Catherine organizing relief for those whose properties had been damaged, and Emma Thompson finding her own strength in the aftermath of her husband's downfall. As Jake listened to the townspeople sharing stories and planning for their future, he realized that his years of studying towns as targets had given him unique insights into building community defenses. Every skill he'd developed as a thief was being repurposed to protect and serve. The badge on his chest wasn't just a symbol of authority. It was a reminder that redemption could come in the most unexpected ways, and that sometimes the best person to guard against theft was someone who knew every trick in the book. The celebration was cut short by the distant sound of hoofbeats approaching from the east. Jake moved to the window, his experienced eyes scanning the darkening horizon where a cloud of dust betrayed the movement of multiple riders. The townspeople fell silent, memories of their recent struggle still fresh in their minds. But this time, they weren't unprepared victims. They were a united community ready to defend their own. Thomas extinguished the saloon's lanterns while James organized the armed citizens into defensive positions they'd practiced during the past weeks. Jake couldn't help but smile at how quickly his improvised training had taken hold. The skills he'd once used to scout towns for vulnerabilities were now protecting this one, transforming weaknesses into strengths. Through his spyglass, Jake counted at least 15 riders approaching from Silver City's direction. Their formation was too organized to be random bandits. These were trained men, likely former deputies from neighboring territories who'd caught wind of Thompson's defeat and saw an opportunity to fill the power vacuum. The desert wind carried the metallic glint of badges that no longer represented justice. Elizabeth and Catherine quietly guided the women and children through the back alleys to the stone church, following the evacuation plan they'd developed. Sarah, who'd proven herself an excellent shot during their practice sessions, took position in the bell tower with her father's old Sharps rifle. The church's height offered a perfect vantage point over the town's main approach. Jake positioned himself behind the livery stable's corner, watching as the riders slowed their approach. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man wearing a marshal's badge from Abilene, pulled up in the street's center. "We're here to restore order." His voice boomed across the empty street. "Your sheriff's badge was never officially revoked. Thompson had no authority to surrender it." The desert air grew thick with tension as Jake stepped into view, his own badge catching the last rays of sunset. "This town's already found its order," he called back, keeping his voice steady despite recognizing several faces from his past life, men who'd chased him across territories. "There's nothing here for you except good people who've learned to stand together." A shot rang out from the marshal's group, splintering wood near Jake's head. But before they could press their advantage, Sarah's rifle cracked from the bell tower, sending the marshal's hat flying. More townspeople emerged from their hiding spots, weapons trained on the intruders. What had once been easy prey had become a fortress of determined defenders. James's voice carried from the shadows of the general store. "Count the rifles aimed at you, Marshal. Even if you win, how many of your men would ride home?" The desert wind whispered through the street, carrying tumbleweeds and the weight of the moment. Jake saw the calculation in the marshal's eyes, the realization that this wasn't the vulnerable target they'd expected. Emma Thompson stepped onto the boardwalk, her presence a reminder of how the town had rejected corruption. "My husband's crimes have been documented and sent to the territorial judge," she announced, "along with evidence of everyone who profited from his schemes. How many of your names would we find in those papers?" The marshal's men shifted uneasily in their saddles. Jake recognized the moment. He'd seen it from the other side often enough. When predators realize their prey has teeth, the hunt becomes far less appealing. The marshal's authority was built on intimidation, but he faced a town that had overcome its fears. Finally, the marshal reined his horse around. "This isn't over," he growled, but his threat lacked conviction. As the riders departed, their dust trail disappearing into the gathering darkness, Jake felt the town exhale. They'd faced their test without firing more than a warning shot, their unity proving stronger than brute force. That night, as the stars emerged over the desert landscape, the townspeople gathered again in the saloon. But this time, they weren't just celebrating. They were planning. Jake watched as Thomas sketched out improvements to the town's defenses, while Mary and William discussed organizing regular shooting practice. What had started as emergency measures were becoming community traditions, weaving protection into the town's daily life. Jake touched the badge that had once seemed like a joke of fate. His path to redemption had led him to defend the very things he once exploited, and in doing so, he'd found something he never knew he was searching for. Not just a home, but a purpose. The desert winds still carried threats, but they no longer found easy targets in this transformed community. The sun rose blood red over Silver City as Jake Miller gathered the townspeople in the dusty street before Thompson's general store. His heart pounded beneath his worn leather vest, knowing this would be their final stand against Sheriff William Davis and his corrupt deputies. 2 weeks of careful planning had led to this moment. The evidence of their crimes, ledgers showing extortion payments, witness statements about murders disguised as accidents, and proof of stolen silver shipments, was safely hidden in Mary Wilson's root cellar. Sarah Thompson stood beside Jake, her father's old Winchester rifle held steady in calloused hands. The shopkeeper's daughter had transformed from a quiet bookkeeper into a fierce defender of justice. Since that night, Jake had stumbled into their store, bleeding from a bullet wound after discovering the sheriff's true nature. She'd risked everything to help clear Jake's name of the horse theft charges Davis had fabricated to silence him. The morning air crackled with tension as Samuel Johnson, the elderly blacksmith, distributed the weapons they'd been stockpiling. His weathered face bore grim determination. He'd lost his son James to the sheriff's justice 6 months ago, shot in the back while allegedly resisting arrest. The truth was James had discovered Davis's smuggling operation using the abandoned silver mine tunnels beneath the town. Elizabeth Miller, Jake's sister and Silver City's schoolteacher, had been instrumental in gathering intelligence. Her position gave her access to conversations between the corrupt lawmen who thought nothing of speaking freely around a mere woman. She documented every detail in her neat teacher's hand, building an irrefutable case against them while maintaining her innocent facade. The sound of hoofbeats drew closer as Thomas Wilson, Sarah's brother, and the town's young doctor finished positioning the townspeople behind makeshift barricades. They'd chosen their ground carefully. The narrow main street gave them clear lines of fire, while the connecting alleyways provided escape routes if needed. Jake had spent days teaching them guerrilla tactics he'd learned during his years on both sides of the law. Sheriff Davis rode in with his dozen deputies, their badges glinting in the morning sun like snake eyes. Jake recognized the cruel set of Davis's jaw, the same expression he'd worn while framing innocent men and ordering his thugs to burn homesteaders off their land. The sheriff's voice rang out, demanding they surrender their dangerous fugitive, meaning Jake, or face the consequences. Catherine Johnson, Samuel's wife and the town's midwife, had positioned herself in the church bell tower with her husband's old sharpshooting rifle. She'd delivered most of these deputies' children, but now she kept them in her sights without hesitation. Her hands were steady, remembering how they'd trembled while closing her son's eyes that terrible night. The first shot came from Deputy Emma Davis, the sheriff's sister, aiming for Jake's head. But Mary Wilson had seen it coming. She'd worked as a barmaid in the sheriff's favorite saloon long enough to read Emma's tells. Her warning shout saved Jake's life as the bullet splintered the wooden post beside him. The battle for Silver City had begun. What followed was unlike any shootout in frontier history. The townspeople didn't just fight. They executed their carefully choreographed plan. Years of oppression had taught them patience, and weeks of Jake's training had taught them strategy. They didn't waste ammunition on wild shooting, but picked their targets with deadly precision. The sheriff's men found themselves trapped by their own overconfidence. Every escape route led them into carefully prepared kill zones. When they tried to reach their horses, Catherine's shots drove them back. When they sought cover in the saloon, they found Samuel Johnson had spent the night removing key support beams, making the balcony collapse under their weight. Elizabeth's students proved invaluable, using their small size to move unseen through the town's network of cellars and tunnels, passing messages and ammunition. The children she'd taught to read and write now helped wage war against tyranny, their innocence another weapon in the town's arsenal. Even the youngest knew which deputies had hurt their families. Jake fought his way toward Sheriff Davis, driven by more than revenge. He'd spent years building a reputation as a horse thief while actually helping homesteaders escape the sheriff's persecution. Each stolen horse had carried a family to safety, each crime on his record matched by a life saved. Now it was time to end the charade. The final confrontation came at high noon, though neither man had planned it that way. Davis stood alone in the street, his deputies dead or captured, his sister Emma surrendering after taking a bullet in the shoulder. The sheriff's facade of authority had crumbled, revealing the desperate outlaw beneath. His words no longer carried weight, his threats falling empty in the dusty air. Jake didn't draw first. He didn't need to. The evidence Mary had gathered was already on its way to the territorial marshal, carried by Thomas Wilson on the fastest horse in Jake's stolen herd. Davis knew it, and the knowledge drove him to make his final mistake. His shot went wild as Jake's found its mark, ending a reign of terror that had lasted far too long. The aftermath brought changes to Silver City that few could have predicted. Jake Miller, the notorious horse thief, was appointed temporary sheriff by a grateful town council. Sarah Thompson became his deputy, their partnership growing into something deeper as they worked to rebuild trust in the law. The stolen silver was recovered, funding improvements that transformed the town. Elizabeth's school received proper funding at last, while Samuel and Catherine Johnson established a home for children orphaned by Davis's crimes. Mary Wilson took over the saloon, turning it into a respectable establishment where honest folk could gather without fear. The town's wounds began to heal, though the scars would remain as reminders of the price of justice. As summer faded into autumn, Jake often stood at sunset watching horses graze in the town paddock. Horses that had once been his crimes, but were now symbols of Silver City's liberation. Each animal represented a family saved, a life preserved, a small victory against corruption. He no longer needed to steal to do good. The law itself had become his tool for justice. As winter approached, Jake's past finally caught up with him in an unexpected way. A rider from Tombstone arrived with news that the territorial governor had reviewed his case, officially pardoning his previous crimes in recognition of his service to Silver City. The pardon came with an appointment as the permanent sheriff, legitimizing what the town council had already decided in their hearts. Standing on the courthouse steps as the declaration was read, Jake felt the weight of his old life fall away like autumn leaves in the wind. Sarah stood beside him that day, her hand finding his as the townspeople cheered. Their relationship had deepened through shared dangers and quiet moments of rebuilding trust in the law. She'd shown him that justice could be found within the system he'd once despised, while he'd taught her that sometimes the spirit of the law mattered more than its letter. Together, they'd forged something stronger than either could have managed alone. The transformation of Silver City continued through the winter months. The silver mine reopened under honest management, with Samuel Johnson establishing fair practices that ensured both safety and profit. Former deputies who had served under Davis were replaced by carefully chosen men and women who understood the difference between authority and power. The jail cells that had once held innocent townspeople now stood mostly empty, used only for the occasional drunk or troublemaker. Elizabeth's school flourished, becoming a model for other frontier towns. She worked with Catherine to ensure that even the orphaned children received proper education, while Mary Wilson's reformed Saloon hosted weekly community gatherings where ranchers and merchants could discuss town business in civilized fashion. The establishment became known as a place where deals were made with handshakes instead of gunfire. Jake's knowledge of horses proved invaluable in establishing a proper relay station between Silver City and Fort Worth, improving communication and trade. The same skills he'd once used to steal horses now helped him track rustlers and maintain order across the territory. His reputation grew not as a thief, but as a fair-minded lawman who understood both sides of justice. When spring arrived, bringing new grass to the desert and fresh hope to the frontier, Jake and Sarah married beneath the old cottonwood tree where they'd first planned their resistance against Davis. The ceremony united not just two people but symbolized the town's rebirth. Former victims and reformed wrongdoers stood together, sharing in the celebration of what they'd built from the ashes of corruption. The desert landscape remained harsh, but Silver City had become an oasis of justice in the territory. Other towns sent representatives to study their methods, particularly the balance they'd struck between law and mercy. Jake's experience as both outlaw and lawman gave him unique insight into maintaining that delicate equilibrium. He never forgot the lessons learned during his days as a horse thief, using them to distinguish between those who broke the law from necessity and those who did so from malice. As summer returned, bringing with it the anniversary of Davis's defeat, the town gathered for a celebration that was part remembrance, part thanksgiving. Stories were told of both the dark days and the triumph that followed. Children who had once hidden from corrupt deputies now played at being lawmen, their games reflecting the trust that had been restored in the badge. The horse paddock remained Jake's favorite spot for quiet reflection. Each evening, as the sun painted the desert mountains in gold and purple, he would stand at the fence watching the animals that had once been his means of survival. Sarah often joined him there, understanding his need to remember where he'd come from and how far they'd all traveled together. Silver City had become more than just another frontier town. It was living proof that justice could grow in the harshest soil when tended by honest hands. The story of the horse thief who became a hero spread throughout the territory, not as a tale of gunfights and vengeance, but as a reminder that redemption was possible for both individuals and communities willing to fight for what was right.